Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is episode 177, Teaching Skills, Not Songs, with Anthony Trecek-King. This week, Dr. Anthony Trecek-King joins the Choralosophy conversation by joining me to discuss two related topics: the teaching of musical fundamentals in our classrooms and how we can have better and more productive conversations about social justice and the inequities in our society in our classrooms. If you're having trouble figuring out how those two things are related, stick around. This episode is for you. We range from concrete in-class activities to try with a choir to develop the inner ear, all the way to the core tenets of Anthony's Face Your Neighbor training that is related to facilitating in-class social justice conversations. We even discuss the annual controversy surrounding removing sight reading from honor choir and all state auditions. You are not going to want to miss this one. Of course, the music literacy tool that I use the most frequently is Sight Reading Factory. So at sightreadingfactory.com, I can custom design exercises for each individual kid, and I can put a trajectory for their music literacy growth in place in a very similar way to how our reading colleagues use leveled readers. They also use sight words. They use flashcards. There's a lot of things that our other colleagues do in these areas. And on Sight Reading Factory, I find all of that creation of content very easy because of how customizable and how quickly the algorithm regenerates unlimited exercises that I can copy, I can take screenshots, I can turn them into flashcards, I can do all kinds of things with Sight Reading Factory. Now, of course, you can use Sight Reading Factory in whatever way makes sense for you, but make sure that you enter Choralosophy at checkout when you sign up for your membership and for your students to have their memberships. Over at Patreon, we have a big library full of resources that you can have access to. I call it my Google folder full of goodies. There's also, of course, the private podcast feed, but I discover every time I poll the Patreon supporters, most of the people who chip in $3, $5, $8, $10, whatever it is a month that they choose to chip in over there, they don't really do it for those resources. They do it because they want to support this show and make sure it continues. So if you want to be there for any reason, then head over to patreon.com/Choralosophy and sign up today. I'm excited to tell you about Ludus.com, a new platform designed for the performing arts by people from the arts. With Ludus, you'll have access to a friendly, knowledgeable customer success team that's available when you need them. And the best part, there are no setup costs, contracts, or hidden fees. It's 100% free to your program, so why not give it a try and see how Ludus can help you streamline your operations and put the focus back on your passion for the arts. Choralosophy listeners can go to ludus.com/Choralosophy for an upgrade for free to their marketing suite. The show is produced on Patreon by Venture Studios, Ryan Main, Michael Herron, Kyle Peterson, Stephen Kathy Kakachik, David Kowalczyk, Max Jackson, Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, John Warner, Angie Schilling, Nathan Hines, Jared Hendricks, Brian Long, and Jonah Clixbull. Okay, everybody, I am here with Anthony Trecek-King, and who is, of course, the second Trecek-King to appear on the Choralosophy Podcast. Anthony, I think we should have a conversation about some choir stuff with you today, and I'm really excited to talk about training the ear. I'm excited to talk about implementing social justice in the classroom. There's a variety of topics we're going to try to center our conversation around, but welcome to the show.
Yeah, Chris, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. And you're right, I'm the second. Not offended by that at all. No, I'm just only kidding. So I'm excited to be here and look forward to the chat.
Yeah, it's just such a funny and interesting thing. Melanie was in episode 145, I think. I think you're going to be episode 178 or 9, something like that. And that simply came about because one of the things we do here is we like to really dig into ideas. I always say that this platform is not designed to be a how-to presentation that you would see at a choral convention. It's more of like going underneath the layers of what people think and believe about their art form, and of course Melanie's content is kind of about that. How do we know what we know, and why do we think what we think? And so that it's funny that her path crossed mine before yours did. But I'm super excited you're here.
Yeah. No, it's okay. I would pick her every time over me anyway, so it's totally fine.
That's awesome. Now, for the people who in my audience who live under a rock and don't know who you are, why don't you give us the kind of the origin story? Who is Anthony Trecek-King? What do you do every day? How would you describe yourself to the folks listening?
Sure. So Anthony Trecek-King, of course. I'm a choral conductor based in Boston. We've been in Boston for about almost 20 years now. So coming up on 20 years. It's been about 18 years in Boston. Prior to that, I was living in Nebraska, which is where I did some of my schooling and got my start in choral music, both in high school, but then my first teaching job was there in Nebraska at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Moved out to Boston, worked and was the artistic director of the Boston Children's Chorus for about 15 years. And now I'm the resident conductor of the Handel and Haydn Society. I've taught at the Hart School for a number of years as well at the University of Hartford. And so just out there trying to impact the world is in the most positive way as I can.
Well, that's wonderful. And I know just a personal connection when you came to Missouri for All-State Choir. Some of my students were there and just absolutely had an incredible experience while you're there, and impacted some. In fact, I saw one of those students, and I don't know how many years that was, 8 or 9 years ago, probably. Do you remember?
Yeah.
That sounds about right.
It's about 8 or 9 years ago.
Yeah, I saw one of those students yesterday, actually, and
wow.
it came up.
You're kidding.
No. He didn't even know you were going to be on my show. But just, I think it was the experience of the "I'm building me a home" performance. The way that was just so impactful for them.
That was an incredible All-State. It's very rare that you have an All-State in which you have 3 standing ovations, and standing ovation after the first song, and then a couple songs later another standing ovation, and then one after the end. As an audiences don't give standing ovations in the middle of a concert. It's just not something that you see that often. And the students really, they went on a journey, and it's to the credit of the great teaching that's happening there in Missouri, yourself included, that the students were open to go on such a emotional journey. Musically they're phenomenal. Just really, it's one of the best All-States that I've conducted. So without question, but emotionally and kind of culturally, they're able to kind of transport through time and space and recreate something that had an impact on the audience. And that to me is something that I love to dig in and go for. That's the thing that I like to go for, and they were able to go there with me.
Yeah,
so it's awesome.
Yeah, it was pretty incredible. Now I don't remember. I remember that there was a standing ovation towards the beginning, but I don't remember what that first piece is. Do you happen to remember?
Yeah, it was "I'm Building Me a Home."
That the first piece was?
Yep. I opened with that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. That makes sense then.
Yeah,
I think, all right. For some reason in my memory, that was towards the end of the program, but maybe that was because it was so impactful.
Yeah. That's one I like to open pieces with, because it's kind of a whoa, type piece. And especially when they pull it off like that. And we staged it. That was the really cool thing, is that we had this, because they were so good, and the music choral community in Missouri is just amazing. We were able to take the time to stage the piece, and when you're able to stage it, it lifts it even further off the page, and I think makes the reception very visceral.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting thing because, since we're kind of talking about the way the Missouri choir students are, we hear that a lot here from All-State clinicians, that the Missouri All-State is kind of different than many others. And it's an interesting thing because at least in some of the larger metropolitan areas in Missouri that have choral music education, there is I think my colleagues around this area do a really, really good job of kind of incorporating the music literacy concepts with, as you said before, some of the cultural concepts that they really want to explore. Music in many ways. In fact, on your website, it's actually a perfect segue, I think, because there's an article that you wrote about teaching people to be more than just singers of songs, but thinking musicians, and musicians that are kind of trained to open up a score or hear a piece of music and start peeling it apart in their mind for all the different parts that they are hearing and that they're seeing and why it is the way it is. So it's a really neat thing. And of course, our All-State audition, I'm really happy overall with the way we do it. There's a lot of things I would different for a different podcast that I would do differently, but for the most part, we have, they do a prepared solo, they learn their part of a choral piece, and then they also have a literacy part of their audition, and so it's very wide ranging. Like they have to know some key signatures. They've got to be able to pre-learn a part, but they also have to sight read a part, and all these types of things. So the things that choral musicians need to do. So one of the things that I'm interested in hearing you kind of talk us through is why you have this kind of skills, not songs mantra. Where did that come from, and why do you believe it's important?
Yeah, I think it's something that came up very early in my kind of choral development. So when I was in high school, my principal instrument is actually cello, not voice.
Oh,
And so I played in the youth orchestra and it was very interested in that side of the world. But then I decided to try out for the school musical as a freshman, and I sang "Poor Jet Is Dead." I had to learn that one. Still remember that from Oklahoma. But I got in, and the choral director was like, "Well, you have a decently nice voice. Why don't you audition to get into the choral program?" And his name was Don Reimer, and I'll be ever forever grateful for Don Reimer in Bellevue, Nebraska, for his teaching. His son AJ Reimer is now teaching at that same school, doing equally incredible work. And Don, we sat down at first day. So I auditioned and got into chorus. We sat down on the first day of chorus, and he handed out the Rachmaninoff from the Vespers, the Ave Maria, and gave the starting pitches. Great, fine. And then started conducting the piece. It was a cappella, and the chorus around me sang every note perfect. And we finished one pass through, and he said, "Great, now let's start working on the Russian." And I was like, "I'm sorry, what?" It's like, so what just happened here? Because I did not sing any of the notes perfectly. And that got me really interested in I could do it on my cello, but I couldn't do it with my voice. And
mm,
why couldn't I do it with my voice? And so I wanted to learn the skill of being able to sight read and understand music more, kind of in my own body, and how I can connect with music and reproduce those sounds. So that began my journey. And then as I'm going through, undergrad and then, graduate school and then begin teaching, especially when I began teaching, I started to see, well, these skills obviously are really important, because if we can get past the music learning stage, then everything else becomes possible, right? As soon as we get past the notes, then the more important, because when you go to a concert, do you remember if they sing all the notes right? No. I
no,
mean, yes, if they sing, only 10% of the notes right, then you're going to remember that, right?
sure,
But if
sure.
if they're if it's a standard concert where they've learned the music and somebody misses a note, right, we're not going to notice that. But we'll know if we feel the music, right? And
Mhm.
often, especially if you listen to old recordings, even of great orchestras and great choruses, they're out of tune in places, but they're perfectly imperfect. So none of that to me really is. I want to get as past that as soon as possible. So the other thing is that when you're working with young students, um, I want them to remember skills and not remember songs. So when they leave me and they go off into the world, I want to impart them with a set of skills that they can use to help navigate the world, both musical and non-musical skills, um, versus remembering just a collection of songs. I mean, that's great, but if you learn something in middle school and you remember the song, but not the skills it took to learn the song, then I think I've done a disservice.
Mhm.
And this particularly marries with the other thing that I like to do is that there's great inequity in schools, right? And there's inequity in experiences and inequity in what people can get. And I want to try and close that gap because a lot of my work has not been in schools. At the university level, yes, but most of my work has been in the community where you're bringing students from all over multiple different schools together. And I think it's important that they have a common language that they could all work with together. But more importantly, I want to impart skills that they might not be getting in their own school environments, so they're
Right.
able to progress through life. And I think with skills, I know I'm talking a lot, and you can jump in because it's your
No, you're
podcast.
fine.
Um, I think when we talk about skills, uh, there's obviously, Western kind of idea of what music literacy is, right? Sight singing and that sort of thing. But I also place a high emphasis on rote learning and ear training and being able to hear and repeat back. Because sometimes, you don't have time to go through a score, but if you can hear it once and be able to repeat back a very long line, that's an extremely good skill. And the last thing I'll say is that improvisation is another skill that often doesn't get taught in schools, particularly in choirs, because it's sort of like how do we do it?
Mhm.
And that's something that I like to do with all of my courses, especially honor choirs, is to go in and go, we're just going to do some improvisation and learn some things this way. And so there's a bit of a process to it, but once you can do it, it can be really, really exciting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good summary. I'm going to jump into a couple of the things that you said there, and we can dig deeper because one of the things you talked about, the Western concept of sight reading. I'm not sure I agree that that's a Western concept exclusively, in that there are other music notation systems that you learn to read.
Yep,
Indian
agreed,
classical music
agreed.
would be an
Yep.
example. But I would say that in our Western Hemisphere world of music, then yes, we think of it that way, and we think of the notation system that we use. Another thing, though, that I find interesting is that a lot of people tend to think about two separate things, which is the sight reading and the learning by ear, as if they're separate. And I actually believe that it's well, and I've talked about this a lot on the show, actually kind of laid out the neuroscience of it. You actually can't read music unless you have developed your ear. And that's I think you even linked to on your website to Edwin Gordon, the audition stuff, which you can't. It's physically impossible to look at symbols on a piece of paper that you've never heard what they sound like and just know what they sound like. That's not how reading works, right? So I always think about it's not rote or reading, it's rote and reading, and it's rote before the reading, because you've got to have some type of a way to establish in the student's mind, what does it sound like to sing a third? What does it, even if that is that they learned a song by rote 2 years ago, and then you remind them what that song sounded like, and oh, that's a third, that's a major third. Oh yeah, okay, and then they can start to make that connection. Thoughts about that non-binary between the audiation, reading, and developing the ear?
Yeah, it's a bit of a false dichotomy, and you're right,
Yes.
especially on the reading by a sight, right?
Hmm.
Reading music in that way and kind of deciphering those abstract notations into sounds, right? You have to have something to link it to. I think it's
Hmm.
possible to learn rote without learning how to read, right
Yes.
music. So in that way, it's a great place to start. 100% agree. So yeah, I think it is a bit of a false dichotomy that both is ideal. And I think when we talk about equity, because I work with a lot of I historically have worked with a lot of students who are from underserved communities, and when we talk about giving people the skills to be successful in life, they have to learn how to read music, off the score. And so taking what they already do well, which is often rote learning, and then attaching it to music learning off the page is something that I really enjoy doing. And going, okay, you're already doing this. Now let's just kind of get it from here and just kind of get this literacy up on that side of things.
Yeah.
Conversely, the other thing that I've learned is that yes, that people do, if you've learned to read off the site, and let's say you're a good pianist and that sort of thing, your rote learning is okay, right? It's got the basics. It's got short snippets of it, right? Like it'll have intervals that have short, but it's the how long can you rote learn, right? Can you take an entire 8-bar phrase and repeat it back exactly? They probably have the first couple. So that to me is a skill that can be developed. Is kind of the depth of the rote learning could be increased. But as we
Yeah.
all know, as we're all musicians, we go through this. As we've studied, the dictation, and can let's play a 4-part chorale thing, and can you dictate every note and all the voice leading, get it right? I mean, we all have to do that stuff, but that's not something that 13-year-old is doing. So how can you take pieces of that and inject that in there? The other
Yeah.
thing that really inspired me to do some of this stuff is I like to read a lot of books outside of music and try to apply them to music. So there's a book called The Talent Code by Daniel Coyle. I think I
Yes.
got the.
It is. It
You know
has
that book?
been reviewed on the show. Yeah. Hmm.
Okay, yeah.
It's an
So
incredible
that's
one.
that's it's an incredible book. And okay, great. Let's take some skills and create little miniature things. How can we kind of distill the skills into activities and then put it in their way and see if it works, and then
Hmm.
experiment. And if it doesn't work, then it's my fault, not theirs, and then go back and try again.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing, of course, that as educators, we pull out of a book like that, is the precious. It kind of made me, at least for me, when I read that book, it made me feel like I took every second of my class period a lot more seriously. In other words, that all those seconds are precious, and they need as many opportunities to form those neural pathways for those tiny little activities in music as possible. And we kind of also see from reading that book how big of a deal it is when you learn it wrong. And
Yeah.
when you learn to do it wrong, how much work it takes to undo that process and create a new neural pathway and all of that kind of stuff. And so, the for those that have not read the book, thinking about example, I think that was used in that book of the Brazilian soccer players that would oftentimes grow up playing soccer in a tiny alley, which would mean that their reaction time to the ball getting to them would have to be just that much faster. And so they were getting way more repetitions of a lot of the soccer activities than a typical player on a big full field would. And talking about how that might have led to a Pele or, somebody like that. So it's just such an interesting concept for how we structure our rehearsals.
Yeah, it definitely is. And so I played baseball when I was growing up and played through college, and it was that piece of it. And then I coached a little bit when I was finished with college, and looking at it, when I was an undergrad, I'd had to spend just as much time practicing baseball as I would playing the cello, right?
Yeah.
And I started to draw parallels from back there, of going, oh wait, if I'm doing this to acquire this skill and this to acquire this skill, aren't they essentially the same thing? And so I have in baseball, I have a whole cadre of things to kind of fix a swing and really kind of develop a swing. Do I have the same thing over here in cello? Well, yeah, there's exercise books and things like that. But what about vocally and how I teach? No, I don't. That piece of it was missing. And so it's sort of like, well, what can I develop over here in the vocal area that matches what I'm doing with cello, that matches what I'm doing in baseball. So yeah, it's just fun to kind of think about these things and go, okay, this is interesting. The other thing that really kind of inspired me is I was in the Netherlands at the Eric Erickson Masterclass doing some work with the Netherlands Chamber Choir, which is one of the best choirs in the world. I mean, they were doing things that with me, I was just like, I don't even know how this is possible. This is so amazing. And I was like, well, there's nothing special about them as human beings, right? A human is a human, and I mean, obviously there's a curve of talent, and yes, their voice has to be really great, but what did it take for them to get there? And then at that same time, there's another conference going on, and the Netherlands Children's Choir was there, and I went and sat in on the Netherlands Children's Choir's rehearsal, and I went, oh, that's how they're that good, because
Yeah.
I saw what they were doing in their rehearsal, and there's nothing special about kids, Dutch kids, but there was something special about the training they were receiving and their
Can you give
uptake of
some
that
examples
training.
of what you saw?
I mean, they would take just, abstract music and they were like, okay, change the mode. We're gonna sing this in Phrygian now. And they would just like snap, 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 all by ear. And the instructor gave very little, they give one pitch, and they go, okay, great, we're in D major. Can we now go to, B flat and sing the same thing in B flat without giving a new pitch? And it's just sort of like, I didn't know kids could do that. You know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean? Of course, I was very young then, and of course they can do that. And so that made me go, I'm going to go home and I'm going to do the exact same thing. And I'm just going to throw stuff at them and I'm just going to keep going because I don't have an ed degree. All my degrees are in performance. So it's both positive and negative, right? I think the ed degree helps you kind of structure things so that you can build a program and understand but I also think sometimes and this might get me in trouble, but the ed degree also places limitations. This is what we're expecting of a 4-year-old. This is what we're expecting of a 5-year-old, as opposed to the way that I've approached it is I have no idea what they can do, so I can assume they can do anything, and then I'm just going to approach it that way, and then again, when they fail, it's my fault, not theirs, and then I'll reapproach it. Now, I've got a couple of great friends and colleagues who are brilliant music educators. And occasionally I'll grunt to them and like, this isn't working. And they'll go, oh, well, here's why. Developmentally, they're not quite there yet. This needs to happen, and so on and so forth. So having an ed degree would have been tremendously helpful for me.
Yeah.
But the lack of limitations and me just assuming that they can do anything, I think was the inspiration for a lot of things that I've done over the years.
Right. Yeah, no, it's an interesting thing because I know, for example, what you just described in my high school classroom, in my full-time job, one of the things we talk about a lot on this show, and probably what put the show on the map originally, was literacy instruction resource. And I don't play notes for kids on the piano ever from the beginning of ninth grade. So once they walk in, regardless of whether or not they have choir experience or they're brand new, they've never done choir before, we just don't do it. We give a starting pitch, and then they learn the skills of doing the mental math or audiation to figure out the distance between their notes. And it's slow and painful at first. And there are probably several kids, in fact I know there are, because I always go back and talk to them after, once they feel like they can do it, and then they're having fun in my class. But we talk about the first 2 months of school, and they go, oh, I wanted to quit so bad, it was so boring. Because in middle school that we would just learn the songs by ear and we could sing like right away. And I'm like, yeah, okay, well, and now how fast can you learn a song? Well, we just pick it up and we sing it. So they're learning the skill, and it's really, and that's I think that's what got me to this position of the audiation, or the tonal memory is not an opposite to the reading. Because what I've discovered over the years of doing it this way is that my kids also have really good tonal memory, and they can sight read almost anything. Because that you have to, in order to be like a high level sight reader, you've got to be able to remember all kinds of pitch in your head and all types of combinations, and of course time relationships for rhythms and all. You've got to be able to feel it all in your head. And it's, I think, just one of the most fascinating things. What are some of the ways that you like to, what are some of your favorite ways that you like to help people develop some of these skills?
Yeah, I think everything you're talking about, I think is amazing, and people are afraid to, not afraid, and I think that's the wrong word, but
Skeptical.
they're reluctant. Yeah, skeptical maybe, or reluctant to make that investment, because I
Mm-hmm.
agree, it's incredibly painful at first, but you reap the rewards later.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just getting through that, and the more that you do it, the faster that painful, or the shorter that painful process can be.
Mm-hmm.
I always told singers when they joined my top choir at BCC that the first couple of months you're going to feel completely lost, and that's okay. That's normal, and I need you just to keep fighting through, and eventually the fog will clear, and it'll be awesome. But
Mm-hmm.
until then, it's gonna be hard, and but just to normalize that this is hard. And so that's one of the things that I like to do at the very beginning, is like, this is hard, this is a new skill, it's going to take you a while, and that's okay, right? It
Mm-hmm.
takes everybody a while, and it may take you 3 months, it may take you 1 month, who knows, right? But you just have to keep fighting through, and that little bit of struggle is you learning, right? We
Yes.
don't want to overwhelm you where you're completely overwhelmed, so I'll be happy to give you additional help outside, because some people need additional help because they don't have that repertoire of intervals in their ears. So that's a big thing. I like to do talk about direct skills. I like to work silently, and so um, let me just give you one pitch. Here's an A, and let's just practice finding keys in our heads. And we're going to use the solfege that we've already developed, and the intervals that you know. We'll go from there. So I'll give an A, and I'm like, great, find a D. Great. That's usually the first one, because it's the perfect fit. It's easy to find. Wonderful. We found a D. That's amazing. And then I'll do it outside. And like, well, how did you go about doing it? And someone will say, okay, if A is so, and I go so fa mi re do, then I found a D. Brilliant. You kind of link those skills together. Great. Now here's an A again. Now let's find an F. And that one usually trips them up, because they just oriented themselves at D major, and all of a sudden F is not in that key. And so it takes them a second. Okay, well, what solfege is A in the key of F? Oh, it's me. Okay, then sing in your head, mi, re, do. Now sing that do and then we just kind of do this over and over and over again until they can find any pitch. And then from there, it's okay, great. Let's go back to the beginning. Here's an A. Find me D major, and then I'll bassist sing a D, tenor sing an A. You just kind of figure out whatever the voicing you want, but let's sing a D major chord. And so we get that, we can find D major chords and so on. So then you go through and find all the chords. So that's a big one that I like to do. The other thing I like to do is use solfege and hand signs and do modulation.
Yep.
And so, where it's do, re, mi, fa, sol, do, ti, do, re, mi, re, do, sol, fa, mi, re, do, and just kind of see how far I can go.
Uh-huh.
And we worked out, so, with chromatic hand signs and so on, then you can just get very modal and then kind of spring your way back. And the game was always, can we end up in the same key in which we started? That's always the thing. And so I just kept doing it and making it harder and harder and harder until they broke.
Yeah.
and then you slow it down. Okay, well, why did this break? And then let's fix it. And then you just keep going. And eventually they make it so that I'm bored. I'm like, God, I really got to think of new things to come up with because all of the stuff that we're doing is just really easy. It's being inventive and trying to figure out ways to kind of in short periods of time. Because you're right, we have very precious little amount of time with them. How can we kind of increase the density of the teaching in such a short period of time?
Yeah. Now, what do you think about this issue comes up, I would say, kind of annually in the choir world, where there are some who would say, because you had mentioned equity before, about some kids are not taught this stuff at school. And so with BCC, you're kind of able to fill in some of those gaps. And there are some who would make the argument that because those things are not taught in school everywhere, there are kids who don't have access, say, for example, to music scholarships and or all-state choirs and or other things. And so what we really should do is just not assess sight reading. We should just not assess that literacy component because not everyone gets to learn it. What is your way of thinking through that topic?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm not sure I have a great solution for it, but I absolutely see the issue because, when we come to all-state courses and some of these opportunities, which, if we start here and then the teaching is we're teaching two different things, right? And then and how we assess it, they move up here and then they're afforded an opportunity because they have that skill, which then does this and it does this, and the gap becomes huge. And so by the time we get to the university level or scholarship time or whatever, and what's being assessed in college is often that as well, that what do we do, right? And so that the inequity is kind of baked into the system. And you see with all-state courses that those who, or particularly ACDA courses as well, those who can make it, they can afford it. Usually it's a two-parent household. Their school has equipped them with the skills they needed to do it. A lot of my singers in BCC, even though they had the skills, they couldn't go to an all-state. They couldn't go to an ACDA festival because they couldn't afford it, right? So
Right.
I think there's lots of barriers that prevent people and prevent the courses. And I don't have a solution, and I wish I did. I think
Can I throw can I throw another side of that coin in there and see what you think about it?
yeah, sure.
So
Yeah.
that part of the problem, I feel like a lot of people get that part of the problem. And Choralosophy listeners will remember RyanMain.com, but he has recently created EndeavorMusicPublishing.com, which is something different, something bigger, and something better. Endeavor is not a marketplace. It's a traditional publisher with a 21st century business model, which means that they have editing. Each piece is chosen and selected with accessibility in mind. Endeavor supports composers with a majority of the sales going right to the composer. Plus, there are tons of voicings to fit the needs of your program, instant downloads, full recordings, practice materials, and more. So head over to EndeavorMusicPublishing.com now and check out the catalog. It's like in economics, it's the seen versus the unseen consequence. I tend to look for the unseen as much as possible. So here's how I think about this all-state issue. The main purpose of choral music education is not all-state choir. That's number one. So, for example, in my program we have a large number of kids typically who make the all-state choir for our area. But maybe that's 5 or 6 of my 220 kids. So they don't, I don't teach so they can make all-state choir, right? So I've got to think about all of those other kids, and then I think about that systemically, where let's say we were to take away sight singing, so that kids from schools that don't teach that skill could also make the all-state choir. and if we believe that literacy is an important skill to give to kids for their success in music, then what I would be worried about is that we would be giving those schools that aren't teaching that skill and those systems that aren't teaching that skill a pass, because then what they do is they get to say, look at how good our music programs are, but meanwhile they get to continue not teaching those skills. Thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying, is that you obviously don't want to reward or have people get the false impression that things aren't, that we're not undoing the inequities that are already there, right?
Right.
Yeah, no, I completely understand that. To me, it's a very tough question. It's a very hard question in which I don't have an answer, and I'm not necessarily sure that eliminating literacy at some way, maybe perhaps it's opening up what literacy means. I don't know, and what we're saying, and to your point, is that if we look at only at the all-state level and say, well, this is the measuring stick, then I think we're missing it, because we have to kind of fix the system or address the system itself in order to be able to kind of have more equity in the system. Because we could say, okay, let's remove sight reading altogether. Okay, that's fine. But would that necessarily fix the system? I'm not sure it would.
No.
Right. I think we'd still have the same issues.
The kids who could take voice lessons would make it, and
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so we end up in the same spot. And that's the one thing that I felt really strongly about in my teaching, is that the world is the way the world is. Let's just go back to the way it is. Mm-hmm. I can't fix the inequities in the world, but I can give you the skills that you need to be successful in an equitable world. And so that's my main point. I think we should value different modalities of learning music. But I want everybody to have all the different ways to learn music.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And so I want, to me, we could add, well, let's add improvisation as a skill that needs to be, you've got to be able to improvise to a chord progression vocally. And that's going to be one of the things that we judge for all-state. We can add that, and a lot of people would fail at it. Right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Because it's not something that's being taught. But some people would be excellent at it because it's something that they've grown up with. So it's what gets measured is what's going to get taught. And I think that we should be measuring lots of different things. It's a great non-answer to your question, just because I don't have a solution.
You're exactly, no, I think it's the right answer, because it indicates that you're thinking about the topic. A dogmatic person has the exact answer, and I think that, the only dogma I would say is that I believe that literacy is important. So taking away that assessment would be bad, because it would result in more kids not learning to read. Now, but then what I would also say, though, is I agree with you that we should honor other modalities of learning and encourage teachers to do more improv. So, for example, I've had some friends on this topic would say, well, yes, but maybe we need a tonal memory component to the audition as well. And I'd be like, yeah, sure. Now, I do also know that the kids who are really good readers are also probably going to be the better tonal memory people, because they've developed that audiation. Right. But so, for example, in Missouri, there are 174 total points that each kid can accrue for the entire audition. 24 of the 174 are sight reading points. And so the proportion of how the sight reading is weighed in their score also is, I think, important. So let's say you want to add a tonal memory part, and that's another 25 points or something. And you've got all these different things. And I think it's really just about the proportion. I would definitely not, even as much of a sight reading, evangelist as I am, I would definitely not say the all-state choir should be 100% sight reading. All of their points come from sight reading, because I've got kids in my program. I've got kids who can sight read anything like a little computer, but they sound like 11-year-olds. So they shouldn't be in the sight read. In the all-state choir either. So it's just an interesting. And you're right. There is not a definitive answer that would work everywhere.
And that's so there's two things. There's not an answer that will work everywhere. And I think these things are local and people have to kind of deal with what's going on in their own
Mm-hmm.
communities.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing that you talk, it's a question, I guess, for the Missouri Allstate. If somebody were to get a 2 on their sight reading and then max out on everything else, are they making it into the Allstate?
It depends on the region. So in Missouri, we audition against our region and then send a certain area, like a certain number that's allocated by population.
Yep.
So in the Kansas City Metro, the answer is no. You would not make all-state choir with a 2 out of 24.
Okay.
In some other areas, you would.
Yeah.
So it,
Yeah.
it just depends on the competition. So in the Kansas City Metro is just like sight reading Disneyland, and so everybody can do it, and so you're pretty much needing
Right.
to get a perfect score on those types of things in Kansas City. So yeah, no, that's a good question because, but again, I also think in some ways that's the type of locality that you're talking about. Is that if that's not a as long as there's a way to make those adjustments for the local area based on the access to the certain things that the kids have.
Yeah, yeah. So for me, I think it's let's have the conversation. Let's have lots of conversation, and
Mm-hmm.
let's agree that we're not necessarily getting the results that we need. Um, in the sense that are we having access for everybody to be able to get into and if not, then why? And then what is it that we can do to kind of fix the issues and know that this is going to be very messy. And but we need to continue to work on it so that way folks can have access, right? And I think also, again, it comes back to if they get in, can they afford to go?
Right.
Can they is that still that's still a barrier,
Right.
right?
Yep.
And like I said, I had plenty of singers who could have been in the Massachusetts All-State Chorus, plenty. And rarely did every year maybe one or two would go because it was something that they could do.
Yeah.
And same thing with the All-State ACDA courses and so on. Plenty of singers who could do it. But
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
there's
That's
lots of ways.
that's tough, and I think that might be a good kind of also trajectory into the other part of our conversation that I found on your website, this Face Your Neighbor presentation that you had from years ago that talks about some of the certain aspects of the social justice and music education. And I think the sight reading at Allstate is a social justice and music education topic. Not it's explicitly one, that's and there are, of course, different aspects of a variety of social justice related topics that could come up in a classroom. But you've got this presentation which I looked through, and thought it was really, really good. Could you tell us kind of what brought that about? Was this for a convention? Was it something that you did years ago? Like, what's the background there first?
Yeah, and I'm still giving it actually. I want to say it was for a Course America conference that I put together this presentation first, and it was the one that was in Boston. And so we delivered the presentation, and it went well, and so on. It's based on what I do in a choral classroom, and what I've historically done, what is kind of integral to the Boston Children's Chorus. And that's basically getting in a room with people who are very different from yourself, and how can you kind of work together towards a common goal.
Right.
And then since then, particularly during the pandemic and with George Floyd and so on, I just kind of put it out there. We're in the pandemic. I put it out there online of, hey, I just feel like we need all to be doing something. So here's this presentation I'll give online. Just sign up for it, and it's like sold out because
Mm-hmm.
my Zoom only. I should have upgraded my Zoom and had more people in it, but it sold out. So I ended up giving it, I don't know, it's something like 30 times over the summer, to different places around the country, and then it eventually went outside the country. Since then, Melanie and I have put together a composite of this called Critical Conversations, where we went in with the state of Colorado ACDA chapter, and we gave a series of 14 workshops over a year with them, just kind of steadily kind of working through different topics, of which the Face Your Neighbor was one chapter of the 7 that we ended up delivering
Okay.
twice each. So yeah, that's kind of what it is that we do, and it's just my way of kind of what I've learned over the years of how to get a room full of singers who, like I said, don't know each other, and how to create a space in which they can be most successful. And
Hmm.
then eventually tackle difficult topics through conversations in that space.
Right. Yeah. Now, is it okay if we dig in for a few minutes?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So you have a slide towards the beginning. It's labeled as the foundation, and there are bullet points. And the foundations are that all voices are welcome. Everyone has biases. That sounds like Melanie. Be compassionate, and this is difficult. It's something that we're always working on. So the thing that jumps out at me there on that opening slide is that sometimes I think first I'll make a distinction, and I want to see what you think about this distinction or this binary, I guess. There are these types of thoughtfully constructed presentations on social justice. That's one side of the coin, and how to implement those things. And then there's the way it gets talked about on social media. And then those are two completely different things. So, for example,
Yeah.
all voices are welcome. Well, not if you're having a conversation about it in a Facebook group. Everyone has biases. That tends to be, yeah, everybody else has biases. I don't have biases. Everyone else does, though. Right? These are those types of those conversations. Is that something that you ever think about, that distinction? Is that, or you just try to ignore that, or how does that live in your world?
No, no, 100% agree that I think the online space is way more difficult to have these conversations than it is in person.
Yeah.
And Melanie does a good job, I think, of trying to manage her spaces. But even in her managed spaces, she runs into people who are just not able to have um, good conversation. And so I think it is difficult online. For whatever reason. And so
Mhm.
for me, I tend not to have these conversations online, in Facebook groups and so on. It doesn't match up with how I can kind of exist in this space. And so I'm more apt to do it in person. I think it's harder to have um, uh, conversations that go off the rail so quickly in person. It's
Hmm.
still, you can have conversations that go off the rail in person. That's absolutely the case. But it's easier to sit down and say, okay, let's have a discussion about this. I see what you're saying, but here's how I'm feeling about it. The other thing that I tend to do is not search for solutions. Um, I'm more interested in having the conversation and then thinking about it, and then maybe coming to a solution later. But for example, I was in England, in the UK, working with a London youth choir, and we were doing something, and then I tend to do stuff musically, and then go, okay, now let's have a conversation. So we started launching into a conversation about something related in the UK, and I can't remember what it was. And there was somebody in there who was like, no, but here's the solution, here's the solution, here's the solution. And I'm like, well, hold up, we're not. That's not the goal. The goal of the conversation is just to hear what people are thinking.
Hmm.
So let's stop having any solutions. We're not going to solve things today. There's no way we're leaving this core classroom and coming up with a political solution to something that's going to happen for all of the UK. That's just not happening. So let's just kind of hear what people's thoughts are first. And then maybe in a later conversation, we might be able to come to a conclusion. But I think just getting out of the habit of like, there is a solution, there's a right and a wrong, and there is something that needs to be solved in this very moment on Facebook. I think that's dangerous, and I think for me, I'm more interested in hearing the variety of thoughts that are out there, as long as they're done in a respectful way. And when I say all voices are welcome, I do mean that. But I think being, spewing venom, it shouldn't be accepted. I mean, there's lots of things that shouldn't be accepted in good conversation. But just because you have a different opinion of mine. Oftentimes, I find as a facilitator, the role of a facilitator is to make sure that all voices are welcome.
Right.
So in the choral classroom, when I'm having these conversations, I'm not on a side. I don't pick a side. I also think it's dangerous for us as choral leaders, especially when we're working with young people, is that we can have unfair influence over the way they think, and I rather
Absolutely.
know what they think versus me imparting what I think. And again, there is a line, right? If somebody is explicitly being a complete jerk and insulting and so on, you stop and say there's no place for that in our classroom.
Right.
But just because you have a different opinion on whatever the topic, what's religion, what's politics, whatever it is, it doesn't mean that your opinion is completely invalidated, right?
Right.
I'd rather get because you can't change minds. You can't move us forward if someone is being silenced. And I rather hear what they have to say and then try to see where we might be able to go with it.
Right. Now, yeah, no, that's really good. And I would say your stance on that of feeling like you're gonna, as the teacher, not pick a side, is actually not a super popular stance in a lot of spaces. There would be many people probably who would say, no, you pick a side. If we're going to have a conversation about social justice, you talk about the right way to approach it. And of course, that's of course dripping with political context, because of course everybody's going to come at it with their own baggage, and every conversation is going to be a political minefield, especially when you're talking about public schools. And there are a lot of teachers who would just rather not talk about it at all because they don't. What if they say something wrong that offends somebody, or whatever? So that's an interesting thing, and I actually think that's really important that the teacher. I agree with you that the teacher needs to model the every voice is welcome thing, because I don't see how society heals at all if we don't approach that with common humanity for each other.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, what you said about it's a minefield for teachers. 100% agree. Like again, I've not taught in the public school, and
Mm-hmm.
and I can see how potentially one's job could be on the line. And so therefore, let's not have this conversation. Yeah, I have empathy for that position, but I don't know what it's like to be 100% in that space where I was working and where I've always worked. I've been encouraged to have these conversations. So me not having the conversation would actually be me not doing my job.
Right.
And so I had to learn. When I first started at BCC, I didn't have any of these skills. Like I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And you get in there, and there's plenty of conversations that I screwed up. And at the end of my Face Your Neighbor, it's like you will screw this up, and that's okay. Like the only way to become better at facilitating conversations is to have conversations and screw them up and go. Uh, you also have to know when to pull the plug of like, we're going down this path. Okay, we need to stop. Let's go back to doing music. Because sometimes a conversation can begin to spiral, and you've got to go, we're good. We're good. And also you have to know when not to have the conversation. There's plenty of times where, can we talk about such and such? Not now, because I'm not prepared or I'm not emotionally regulated to be able to have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So, sometimes we as facilitators, we have to, or teachers, leaders, if we're not in the right headspace, then we can't have a good conversation. So we have to put ourselves in the right headspace first before we can launch into that conversation. I
Right.
remember there was with BCC, it was during the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. They wanted to have that conversation so bad, and I was like, I can't, because I'm not ready. I haven't read enough. I don't understand the situation, and emotionally, I'm not in a place where I can have this conversation.
Yeah.
Eventually, we did, and it was a phenomenal conversation. And in fact, several of my students still talk to me about that conversation, about the importance of having it and the way that it was handled. And it's again, I think we go for solutions so quickly in these conversations, that gets in the way of actually having a good conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should avoid going for the solution right away, right? The world is full of problems. It just
Or
is.
or
Always
to
will
enter
be.
into the conversation with a strong belief that you already have the solution. It, that
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
that's a barrier for a lot of people, because then they're probably not going to have a productive conversation unless the other person agrees with them already. In
Yep.
which case, why have the conversation?
Yeah, then there's a goal. Their goal is then to kind of move the conversation to this specific place,
Right.
right? And again, when I get into these conversations, I absolutely have an opinion on what I think is going on in the situation, what the solution could be. Like I have an opinion. Like we're human beings. It's something that's certainly there, but I avoid, at all costs. For one, it's being aware of what my opinion is, and then being aware of what is the goal of this conversation. Like, why are we having this conversation?
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes, to your point, that people are unaware of, we're having this conversation because I want to move the conversation from point A to point B. And no matter what, that's where we're going. And I rather see what point A, point B, point C, point D, what are things that I haven't thought of, and understand how the people in front of me are feeling. Um, because that's the humanity in my place. Like,
Yeah.
when we talk about our culture, we in our culture currently right now, it's constantly shutting down conversations.
Hmm.
And I'd rather open up conversations and say, let's have a conversation about it. And I may disagree with you, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I may have a completely different opinion than you do, and that's okay. And again, as long as we're treating people with respect and so on. I have a good friend who lives in Ohio, and I talk about it a lot in my presentations. And he politically cannot be more opposite than I am, right? We vote differently. Uh, he's a proud gun owner, so he owns several AR-15s, and like we could not be more different. Um, but I value his opinion, and I value our friendship because he's able to open up my eyes to things that I haven't seen. Now, I may think he's wrong on things. He may think I'm wrong on things, but we're still able to have conversations. I was just sitting down at dinner, and Melanie was with me and his wife, and looks up at me and goes, "I don't think," and he likes to poke the bear. So this is what I have
Uh-huh.
to do. So he said, "Systemic racism, does it exist?" He says, "Let me just start off and say, I don't think it exists." And I think a lot of people that I know would just flamethrow and say,
Yeah.
"Here's all the reasons why you're wrong." And even myself, I'm like, whoa, okay, where's this coming from? Like, we're just eating dinner. I don't know. But I sat down. I said, okay, but what do you mean? Like, what do you mean by systemic racism? So how can we? Because a lot of our arguments are actually around definitions,
Yes.
and the way that he was defining it and the way that I was defining it are two completely different things. And in his
Yep.
world, the way that he's defining it, he might be right. But I was able to, in that conversation, go, okay, I understand where you're coming from. Let me tell you where I'm coming from. Let me tell you about some of my life experiences. At the end, he and his wife were in tears, right?
Hmm.
And again, my goal wasn't to convince him that there is systemic racism or isn't. That wasn't my goal. It was just share with me what you think. Here, I'm going to show you through some of my experiences, and then maybe we can get someplace. And in that same conversation, I learned some things that how he was thinking and feeling and viewing the world, that had me rethink a little bit. So it's having these conversations where we're able to stand and be resilient, even when we're feeling a little bit of like, whoa, what just happened? I think that's not being taught and that's not being modeled. And I think that we're missing an opportunity for growth. Both my parents grew up in the civil rights South. Like what they had to go through, right? My dad grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. That's where the bomb killed those four girls in that church.
Hmm.
What he had to go through, what they had to go through is amazing. And what I look at and how resilient they are today, how they're able to kind of stand in horrible situations, stand in and still march forward, that's something that I want to model. That's something that I wish I can be, and help to teach other people. And we're not able, from what I'm seeing is that we're less able to kind of withstand something that we disagree with, right? And
Yeah.
stand in that storm, that internal storm, and be resilient and calmly go, that's interesting. I think of the people at the lunch counters and just being food thrown at them and yelled at in the 60s and 50s and 60s. They were able to withstand a lot of things that like I couldn't even imagine.
Yeah.
So when someone yells the N-word at me on the street as I'm just walking down the street, can I stand in that? And can I do something productive? And so that's what I want to impart to people. And that's what I want to teach is, yeah, I know it hurts. It sucks.
Right.
What you're hearing right now, it sucks. But can you be resilient and can you work your way through? Because there is a pathway forward here in which we can all be successful.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And I think earlier you're talking about your friend and that conversation that you had. I think in a lot of ways, kind of going back to my distinction between the in-person conversation versus the online conversation, when that conversation happens online, you haven't the person is we are taught and encouraged to call that person horrible names, say he's a racist, he's a bigot because he doesn't see systemic racism and all those things. But then, of course, the end result, if that's how he has that conversation, is he probably never ends up in tears at the end and thinking about things differently. And I think
Correct. Yeah.
that's where I'm really concerned in general. about because I would say most people's interactions with these types of topics are online. The minority of people are having these conversations in person. And so it's one thing for us to say, yes, of course, it's better to be in person. But I also, like, I'm always shouting from the rooftops, I am worried and I'm concerned because of what percentage of people are having these conversations online. So, I mean, that is I think a valuable little bit of insight. Now, if you don't mind, I would like to ask a couple more questions. Are you good on time?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So you have a couple slides about diversity. This is one of my biggest pet peeves. Another thing that comes up on this show a lot is that I don't think we have a really well-defined and multi-layered concept in many of our conversations about what diversity is and why it's important. So in your presentation, I really appreciated this because on the one of the slides, it has a picture. Everybody's probably seen it, but it's two people looking at a number on the ground, and depending on which direction you're looking from, you might see a 6 or you might see a 9, right? And then of course they're arguing about whether or not it's a 6 or a 9, and all that's different is their perspective. As they're looking at it. Now, that is a textbook example of what many would call viewpoint diversity. That from the direction that you look at a thing, you might be looking at the exact same thing, but it looks different. Now, one of the things that I believe very strongly in, and I want to get your reaction just on this principle, and then I want to see if we can dig into it. But I'm a firm believer in reminding people that you can't see diversity in a photograph. There are so many ways in which we are diverse, but the most popular one to talk about is our skin colors and our sex, right? Those are the things we can see. And I think that there's nothing wrong with including those types of things in a matrix of which we look at diversity. But if that's all we look at and all we care about, then we run the risk of putting ourselves in a group of people that might look like the rainbow, but they all see things exactly the same. They agree with each other politically. They talk about things the same way. They're not challenging themselves. There's no difficult conversations, like I said before, if everyone agrees. And if we don't include that viewpoint diversity that you have in your slide there, then we don't get the benefits of diversity, which you list out on the next slide, like cultural competency promotes growth and reflection, all those things. If we don't have viewpoint diversity, we don't get those benefits. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think diversity of perspective is something that should be valued, obviously, because if you were to go to, in the middle of, like, I grew up in North Dakota, so spent 9 years there as a kid. And it was on an Air Force community, so there was some racial diversity that was there, but very little, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even though that there's some racial diversity there, very little, there was still plenty of other diversity, right? And so sometimes people talk to me, it's like, well, I don't have diversity in my school. I say, yeah, you actually do, because no two people are the same. Everybody's different. They have different upbringings. There's religious diversity, for example. There's socioeconomic diversity. There's a lot of different ways we can define it. Diversity is one of those overused words that lacks definition and needs clarity. So when we enter into a conversation, we say, we're going to talk about diversity. Well, let's define that so that we're all working from the same thing. If it's racial diversity, that's fine, but let's just say that that's what we're talking about. We're having a conversation about racial diversity. Fine, that's great. But we just say diversity at large, it needs further definition. So I think a lot of arguments, particularly online, but even in person, is just around definitions. And let's just clarify what is it you're talking about. That's why I love, well, what do you mean? When someone says something, well, can you explain more? I need you to help me understand what you're saying, so therefore I can actually respond in a right way. So yeah, I think having diversity of viewpoint to me is wildly important. Because if the goal is to get to a better society, then the more voices that we have in that, like one singular voice cannot create a perfect society. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. You need lots of people kind of weighing in and having conversations around the variety of viewpoints that one person has, that you bring to a particular topic.
Yeah. Now, do you ever get concerned? I know I do. I talk about it a lot, but do you ever get concerned that in social justice spaces that are dedicated to the activism for social justice, there's a lot of missing the ball on that viewpoint diversity? I see that. I see we're going to form a committee on DEI, for example, but we're only going to have people on there that see it the way we do and use the same buzzwords that we do and the same lingo that we do. And so then we get this monochromatic conversation about these topics. Do you see that or recognize that at all?
I haven't really thought about it that way, because I always think yeah, I have to think about that actually. It's a good question. If we're missing certain voices in that space, then it's possible that we might be missing something that is going on. I think one of the issues is that for many years, a lot of voices were excluded from kind of how do we construct a business or corporation or an educational space or whatever it is. There was missing voices, and that led to policies and things like that disadvantaged certain demographic groups versus others. And so now that it's kind of a whiplash, right? And so it kind of springs one direction and it goes back. And we know this to be true if we look historically. We can just look through historically and look at policies like redlining and so on. Or why is it we still have a gender pay gap is immense as it is. And so there's things that need to be addressed, and allowing people into those spaces. Sometimes it's a good thing, right? It's a good thing to have people into that. But to me it's can we broaden the discussion so that we bring in a lot of different things as well, so that when we talk about diversity, define it. And again, I think it's perfectly okay to say, in this particular group, we're gonna focus in on racial diversity, and that's the only thing that we're doing. That's fine. Like, as long as it's defined, if that's what we're doing, that's what our goal is, and that's what everybody agrees upon. That's what we want to do. Then that's what we're doing. And I think that's great. But it again comes back to diversity. I think people sometimes say, "Well, we're going to work on diversity," and then people go, "Well, shouldn't that be everything?" And what they actually mean is, we're going to work on this specific type of diversity, right? So it's, again, clarity of definitions will help all of those conversations kind of clear up.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and I think the one of the things, and we probably end with this because I know I've kept you for a long time, but this has been a fascinating conversation. I feel like I probably, by the way, I probably annoy Melanie now in her comments on her stuff, because I just love to talk about the ideas that she posts. But I feel like you and Melanie and myself and probably my wife are just kindred spirits, because these are how a lot of these conversations go in my house as well. But the thing that I find interesting about this topic, and this will be my last prompt, is I see in your slide also that you've got a quote about racism as one of the topics that you discuss in this, and you list different types of racism and different contexts in which racism occurs. And I appreciate that too, because that oftentimes, again, in the social media version of the conversation, the racism tends to just get used as a lump word that encapsulates all the different ways that race is baked into our society. So, for example, somebody might use the word racism when they are talking about systemic racism, but then the other person might hear the interpersonal kind, so you're saying I just hate black people? I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying. But since we use the same word for all the things, it causes a lot of confusion. And you leave a quote in here of Ibram Kendi, who wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I have read cover to cover twice. And because I'm a nerd, and I even did this when I read the Bible, I go through and I take notes. And whenever I'm reading anybody's philosophy, and I make columns of things I agree with, things I disagree with, and things that I just hadn't thought of it that way before, and I have question marks. And so, of course, I read that book, and I have a ton of those. I have things that are really, really good insights that I'm glad he shared. And there are certain things in that book that I found objectionable, all the way to offensive, all the way to stuff that in the middle of things like, oh, I just haven't thought about it that way. That's interesting. I'll think about that some more. And I think what frustrates me about these types of conversations typically is that that type of thought process isn't always welcome. And the reason I want to talk about your presentation is I felt like it was really good in that it mentions multiple times how important it is to open up the conversation to everybody, and to almost say to be able to say, now shoot holes in this idea. What problems do you see? And showing curiosity, showing the humility that it would take to truly bring all voices into the conversation. Thoughts about that?
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's about bringing all voices into the conversation. I think it's more about asking questions and being curious.
Yep.
And also staying humble, right? And going, I don't have all the answers. I don't have all the solutions. Even in our conversation, we talk about the Allstate and what's the solution. I don't have one.
Right.
And it'd be great for me to say, here are the 5 things you need to do to make this could be perfect. But I don't live in Missouri, so I don't understand intimately so that would be very. I'd have so much hubris to sit here and say, here's what you should do in Missouri.
Yeah.
In online, it's very difficult to model good conversations because it's a short format, and so people use short formats. But I think as we're interacting with people online, and again, I get this from Melanie because I don't do this very often. I'm much better in person. But online, can you model the conversation that you're trying to have in person? Because it's not necessarily the interaction with that specific person. It's the interaction with everybody else that's watching that conversation with that specific person. So you may not be, even if you're trying to change, your goal is to change their mind. It's not necessarily that person's mind that you're trying to change. You're trying to change everybody who's watching's mind. And therefore, if I interact with somebody online and be very vicious and just kind of snap at them, I also might be turning off a lot of other people who might be accessible to the ideas that I have. Yeah. So even if your goal is to change people's minds, modeling good conversation in the online space is incredibly valuable, and one that we should do. But in order to, as Melanie always says, the price of admission to having these good conversations is being willing to change your own mind. And if you're not able to be in that space where if there is nothing that could be said that can change your mind, then you've gone too far, right? And so you've got to be able to have these conversations of, I might be wrong. And that's just it. Like, I might be wrong on a lot of things. I can be horribly wrong on a lot of things. It doesn't mean I don't have an opinion. It doesn't mean I don't have a strong opinion. It doesn't mean that my experiences in life don't lead me to where I am and I can't bring those forward into this conversation. But I still could be wrong. Mm-hmm. I still could be wrong. So the only way that I'm going to know if I'm right or wrong is to have more and more conversations, especially with people who think differently than I do. Yeah, absolutely. It's hard. Look, this is hard. I'm not going to say it's easy. It's hard. Yeah. Sometimes we just, we get, we're in our limbic system, and it's fight, flight, or freeze, and there's nothing we could do at that moment. And that's where you step. And this is in the presentation. Step back. You take a break. Think about this. Go to sleep. Have some coffee. Whatever you need to do to kind of regulate yourself, so that when you enter the conversation, you're back in that executive function. You can actually think your way through these conversations. Mm-hmm. If we're all just kind of emotionally limbic out, man, it literally is, it's a fight, and we don't want that. At least I don't want that. Yeah, that's well said. And I wish that model was the dominating model in the conversations that happen about this. And I strongly endorse. You said you're still doing these presentations, so I hope everyone will go out and decide to get their school or their church or something to bring you to do this conversation, because that's awesome, and I'm really glad. So on the way out, do you have any other things that my audience needs to know? Things that you've got coming up, piece of music that they should go check out? Feel free to plug something on the way out if you want to. Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of writing lately, particularly arrangements of spirituals that people don't know. And so I'm just trying to expand that canon. And the style that I'm writing it is not in the 19th century part song style that Burleigh and Harrison and all those folks Undine Smith Moore were writing, but something that you might have heard that in prior to 1865, right? And the more I'm doing these arrangements, the further back I'm kind of going into them, and requires lots of improvisation. Like, that's required in the score, that you have to be able to do some improvisation along with it. So some of those will be coming out soon, and I'll be doing more writing and so on. So I like to that's a shameless plug. Cool. And of course, there will be links to your website. I'm assuming they'll be able to find stuff there, or is there a better place to go look for your scores? Yeah, no, I think that's a great place. Yeah, and you can always email me. A lot of my things are being published with Walton, so you can also go to Walton and kind of look me up there. Very cool. Awesome. Well, Anthony, thank you so much for joining me. All right, thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you all for sticking around to the end of the episode. If you're still listening at the end, you are one of the MVPs, one of the regular listeners. So the things you can do to help on the way out, of course, are like, share, join the conversation in the social media groups, and of course, join the Patreon at patreon.com/Choralosophy. Use the promo code at mymusicfolders.com, mychoirrobes.com. You can use it at sightreadingfactory.com, Endeavor Music Publishing, and Graphite Publishing to get sheet music online. It pays to be a listener to this show. So thanks all everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed that, and we will see you next time.